Have you ever given up your first-class seat to a stranger? They'll call you foolish. They'll ask what you were thinking. But for Ellie Walker, it wasn't a question. It was a reflex, gentle, without hesitation. She saw a wounded veteran struggling alone at the plane's entrance. She saw the deep scars that others turned away to avoid noticing, and she did the unexpected. She surrendered her first-class seat, a rare privilege she might only ever have once, and offered it to him, as quietly as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Ellie didn't do it for praise. She didn't know his name. She had no way of knowing that months later, the red dirt road leading back to her small Mojave, Arizona ranch would thunder with military vehicles. She didn't know that the man she helped was more than a veteran. He was a hero, returning with his unit to rebuild what she had spent years caring for alone. This story didn't begin with a miracle. It began with an act so simple, yet it planted the seed for a harvest no one could have foreseen. Stay with us. You'll never see kindness the same way again. So April in Arizona changes little. The sun doesn't blaze. It merely scorches. The wind isn't fierce but carries red dust that seeps into every seam of clothing, every crack in wood, even into the quietest corners of the heart. Each morning here feels like an old record rewound, note after note. Today exactly like yesterday. And there, beneath the searing sky and parched, cracked earth, stands Ellie Walker. 34 years old, alone, living in a weathered wooden house at the edge of a cantaloupe farm, its pale siding as though the land itself has learned to sigh. That house, that land, once echoed with her father's footsteps, her mother's shadow, and dinner tables where someone always waited. But now only she remains, and crops increasingly unpredictable, as unforgiving as the Mojave after a scant rain year. Ellie seldom complains, not to others, not to herself. She rises before dawn's first light spills across the porch. She repairs the pump with her calloused hands. She cooks batch after batch of melon jam, laying jars out at Kingman Farmers Market every Saturday. Quietly, patiently, almost invisible. They call her the Quiet Woman, a name neither reproach nor praise, as if Ellie were part of the land itself, unremarkable, unassuming, yet enduring through the years. But on some nights, when she sits on the worn steps, watching stars spill through the leaves, her heart twists, a nameless ache, like remembering something that never happened, like an unopened map, like a road yet untaken. Ellie once dreamed of going far, far from these hard fields, far from silent nights broken only by wind, far from the endless repetition she called life. Yet years passed. Her father died of heart disease. Her mother followed 2 harvests later, and Ellie stayed behind, like a keeper of the land, like one bound by promises to her ancestors. She can't recall the last time she left Mojave, so when she opens the pale cream envelope from Portland, her heart skips a beat. The familiar slanted script appears on an invitation, a wedding card from Ruth Hathaway, her old college roommate, now a literature professor. Inside, besides the card, is a surprise so startling Ellie must sit on the old chair by the sink, a round-trip plane ticket from Phoenix to Portland, in her name, her seat already booked. Beneath, a brief handwritten line, "Go, Ellie. Life waits for no one." Simple. No pleading. No lengthy prose. Yet those words felt like an invisible hand, quietly pressing on her chest, where a longing, buried for years, suddenly stirred. She stared at the ticket, hardly believing it was truly hers. Since when had she been invited to go anywhere? Since when did anyone think Ellie Walker could appear anywhere beyond her row of market stalls? For minutes, her mind was a cacophony of whispers. Who would feed the horses? What if the pump broke again? Where would she find money for a proper dress? She'd get lost in the airport. But amid that tangled mess, a clearer feeling emerged. Not daydreaming anymore, but a longing to breathe once, to the rhythm of the world outside. She had never flown, never seen Oregon's misty pines, and if she didn't go now, she might never go at all. Ellie rose, the ticket clutched like a fragile shard of porcelain. She stepped onto the porch, lifted her face to the sky still brushed with pale gold, and in that moment, something gentle unfurled in her chest, like a new bud opening after the season's first rain. She knew she would go, even if she was afraid, even if she had to ask a stranger how to print a boarding pass or find her gate. Ellie would leave the land she'd always loved, but never ceased to yearn to step beyond. For the first time in years, a decision was planted, and that season's harvest would yield more than cantaloupes on Arizona soil. It would yield herself. Okay, dear viewers, stay tuned for the rest of this amazing story. Take a second to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly connect with what I'm sharing here, and drop a comment below to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always wonderful to see people joining us from across the globe. Phoenix Sky Harbor that morning buzzed like a giant, man-made beehive. The scent of metal, polished wood, and rushing people mingled in a chaotic air that Ellie had never known. It was her first time in a major airport. Everything felt alien. Electronic boards flashing codes like secret messages, crackling announcements directing passengers to new gates, long, sluggish lines inching towards security. And Ellie, in her clean blouse, neatly pressed jeans, and polished leather boots, felt as though she'd wandered into a world not built for someone like her. Her hand gripped the ticket bearing her name, so tightly that its corner crumpled, her heart pounding, not out of fear, but because all of this felt startlingly real, so sudden. She was here, not at Kingman Farmers Market, nor in a cantaloupe field, nor at the familiar Route 66 gas station, but in a place where planes roared into the sky and people queued like memories waiting to be stored somewhere up high. As she approached the departure gate, a uniformed attendant gave her a warm smile. "Ms. Walker, congratulations. You've been upgraded to first class." Ellie stared, momentarily stunned, thinking she must have misheard. She managed only to nod and smile in return, her heart water-sloshed by an unseen stone. First class? Her very first flight was already a luxury. First class itself was beyond anything she'd dared imagine. When she stepped inside, Ellie was truly overwhelmed. The brown leather seats felt as soft as warm butter. The overhead lights glowed gently. The air smelled of champagne and cool conditioning. A crisp, white napkin and crystal glass were laid upon the fold-out table. She hesitated to touch the seat back, feeling as though she were borrowing someone else's life. Then, something made her look up. A tall figure was moving down the aisle, slowly, unevenly. He walked with a worn wooden cane, clenched in rough, sinewy hands. A faded Marine Corps cap shaded half his weathered face. His shoulders stooped under a tattered duffel so heavy it pulled him to one side. No one offered assistance. No one barred his path. All eyes slid past him as though he were a cold gust of wind people preferred to ignore, not because they didn't see him, but because they didn't know how to react to a body that war had touched. Ellie remained perfectly still, watching him, just watching, for a long, bittersweet moment. In that fleeting moment, her heart did not think. It simply felt. She did not know who he was. She did not know on which battlefield he'd served. She did not know what he had lost. But she recognized that feeling, the sense of being looked right through, cast outside the boundary of anyone's concern. She'd seen that same gaze in her father's final days, when he sat silently in the rocking chair, skin darkened by chemotherapy, passers-by offering polite smiles while avoiding any real conversation. There is a kind of silence heavier than a flat rejection. And now this man was silently struggling, merely to move a few paces backward, to the cramped economy seats, where wounds would be pressed into tight quarters, where no one would ask, "Does it hurt?" Ellie drew a deep breath. A decision rose in her like instinct. She turned and hurried to him, moving gently as though afraid of shattering something too fragile. "Sir," she called softly, her voice like wind rustling through desert scrub. He paused, looked up, his unfamiliar eyes meeting hers. She held out her first-class ticket, her hand trembling slightly. "Would you like to sit here? It'll make your journey more comfortable." He looked at her, silent. Those deep eyes flickered for a moment, then reached out to take the ticket. No refusal, no hurried thank you, only a small nod, an unspoken acceptance, an unvoiced gratitude. Ellie watched him quietly move into first class, then turned back. The coach cabin was cramped, noisy, far from pleasant. But in that moment, her heart felt vaster than the sky beyond the airplane wing. No one knew. No one filmed it. No one witnessed. But for Ellie, that made the moment truer than anything she'd ever experienced in her life. Ellie didn't think twice. Without a moment's hesitation, without a shred of doubt, she turned her back on first class, with its velvet soft leather seats and warm golden lights that beckoned like an invitation. None of those comforts had even touched her when something in her chest tugged her elsewhere. Not reason, but intuition. Not calculation, but raw, primal kindness. She found him amid the slow-moving crowd drifting backward, his shoulders hunched, the frayed duffel slung heavily on one side, his feet dragged as if each step was a memory pulling him into the past. The wooden cane tapped on the cabin floor, click-clock, click-clock, resonating through the eerie silence. Ellie laid a gentle hand on his elbow. He startled and turned. Under the brim of his military cap, she saw oceans of old turbulence, now only weariness, carefully concealed. She offered him the first-class ticket, no questions asked, no explanations uttered, no moralizing about her own act. She simply chose to give. The veteran stood frozen for a long moment. In the soft glow of the cabin lights, she saw his pupils tremble, as though something deep inside him had been unshackled. His gaze softened. It grew wet, not from sudden emotion, but from something deeper. He was used to being forgotten. And now, someone had seen him. It was just a ticket, a seat. Yet it could also be, for the first time in years, an invitation into the land of peace. He nodded, quietly, and took the ticket with those rough hands that once held rifles, once held lives, once held war itself. No thank you, no tears, no embrace, only that single nod, enough to say his heart leaned toward her. Ellie turned and walked back to coach. She slid into her middle seat. To her left, a large man asleep, his head bobbing in time with his steady snore. To her right, a restless child whose toy kept clattering into the aisle. The space was stifling, cramped. The noise of life crashing around her might have driven her to flee, But she felt no annoyance, no anger. She felt no regret. Her soul was light, like early summer breeze drifting across a field, passing through her heart, bringing an invisible calm, a rare serenity. No one noticed. No one applauded. No camera recorded it. Perhaps that's why the act felt truer, more precious. In a noisy world where everyone craves to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged, Ellie chose instead to do right, quietly, not for glory, not for honor, simply because it was what she believed she must do. Throughout the long flight, she glanced toward first class now and then. Through the sliver of the beige velvet curtain, she caught sight of the old soldier, now sitting upright in soft leather, his face more relaxed, his eyes gazing out the oval window at the endless blue sky. A flight attendant bent down and smiled at him, not awkwardly, not merely out of duty. Her smile was that of someone who realized she was caring for someone truly deserving. And when his gaze returned, whether by chance or intent, they met. For 1 second, no gesture, no nod, just eyes. Eyes that spoke volumes, not "thank you," but "I understand," and "I see you." A language unspoken, a connection between two souls, born of one seat surrendered, and one heart unafraid to share its kindness with someone the world long chose to forget. Ellie turned back to face forward. She closed her eyes. She smiled, a silent smile, not from pride, but because her heart had found a reason to keep believing in the beauty still out there. Dear viewers, take a moment to relax, or grab a glass of water, and stay tuned for more of this surprising story ahead. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a delight to see friends joining us from all around the world. Comment 1 if you enjoyed this story, so we can keep bringing you even more great tales. A week later, Ellie returned to the ranch. Everything was the same. The tin-roofed shed that dripped steadily whenever it rained. The ancient tractor that roared to life with a hoarse cough and shuddered as if it might fall apart at any moment. The water bill taped to the refrigerator with a battered magnet. Daily life resumed its familiar rhythm. But something inside Ellie had shifted, as though her heart had opened another compartment, a space for gentleness, for the silent understanding that some small kindnesses we give and then forget, yet someone, somewhere, still remembers. She went about her usual work, sowing seed beneath the desert sun, hand-watering each young melon plant because the drip system was broken, hauling jars of cantaloupe jam out to Saturday's market, setting them on her weathered table and smiling at every customer. Yet beneath it all, Ellie was no longer the quiet woman who dreamed of a world beyond these fields. She had traveled and returned, with something unnamed inside her, palpable in each steady breath. Until one early July morning. The sun had not yet climbed high. A pale gold light stretched across the ground, casting long shadows from the low bushes lining the fence. Ellie sat on the porch steps holding a cup of milky coffee, her gaze drifting out to the horizon. Then came the sound of engines, heavy, authoritative, echoing like distant thunder. Ellie sprang to her feet. On the dirt road leading into the ranch, dust rose in a fiery red haze. 3 Humvees rolled in, followed by a black military plate SUV. The doors were still closed, but by their bearing she already knew they weren't here to buy melons. The doors flung open. Men in uniform disembarked, one by one, neat and silent. They didn't scan the property like strangers. They moved as if they belonged here. The last man stepped out of the SUV. He wore a deep green beret, his smile understated, yet solemn and unmistakably military. His eyes swept the yard and came to rest on Ellie, coffee cup in hand, lips parted, heart pounding in her chest. It was him, the veteran to whom she'd given her seat. He wasn't clad in uniform like the others. He wore a simple button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up, and the scar on his neck was still visible, softened by the morning sun. But the first thing Ellie noticed was not the scar. It was the change in his eyes, no longer guarded, no longer withdrawn, but clear, as though he'd stepped out of his own darkness. She didn't have time to speak. He walked toward her, stopped before her, returned her salute with quiet respect, then smiled. "Good morning, Ellie. I believe I owe you a proper thank you." She nodded, speechless. And then, as if a fresh wind swept across the plains, he turned and signaled. The soldiers began to move. They spoke little, needed no orders. A single look, a gesture from him, and everyone understood. Ellie stood silent. She still didn't grasp what was happening. But deep inside her, something was on the verge of breaking free. The veteran she had once watched struggle with his duffel and wooden cane now stood in the middle of her ranch, a living testament that sometimes a small moment on a flight, a decision no one notices, can return to you bearing the most unexpected gift. A young soldier approached, handing her a dossier. On its cover was printed her name, Ellie Walker. She opened it, and inside was a handwritten letter, each word penned clearly and carefully. We cannot change the past, but sometimes a simple act can reignite what has long been extinguished in another's heart. Thank you for not turning away. Alongside it was a certificate of honor from the Veterans Support Foundation and detailed plans for repairs, the barn roof, drip irrigation system, tractor, solar power array. Everything was outlined. A crew would remain here for 3 weeks, working pro bono. Ellie watched them, soldiers dismantling old pipes, taking measurements, speaking quietly among themselves as if this were a summer training camp. But she knew. What they were doing went far beyond duty. It was a response to an act no one demanded. The Arizona sky stretched vast and open, and on that July morning, Ellie felt, for the first time in her life, that she was no longer alone. He was Colonel Miles Harper, once the commander of a rescue unit in Afghanistan, a name that among soldiers had conjured courage and devotion. But after a massive blast in Kandahar, he lost almost all the skin on his neck and right arm. In the months that followed, he lived quietly in a treatment camp in Portland, with no photographs on the walls and always wearing a cap pulled low over his face. To him, the outside world had become a luxury, not only because of physical pain, but because of the way people looked at him. His burns had not only scarred his flesh, they had gnawed away at his self-respect and his belief that he still belonged to society. That flight was the first time he'd stepped outside the shell he'd built, and Ellie, with an act so seemingly small, had shattered that wall. "You saw me as a person, not as my scars," he said, his voice low and hoarse, yet his eyes no longer wary as they had been when they first met. In the pale morning light, his words fell like a benediction. The next day, the work began. Colonel Miles did not arrive alone. With him came 6 soldiers, men who had fought under his command in Afghanistan. They wore uniforms, leather gloves, and carried toolboxes as if preparing for a military operation. But this battlefield was the old barn, the rusted machinery, and the rotting roof of a woman who had once dared to put kindness above her own comfort. They started by removing the leaky tin roof. The old planks were taken down and stacked neatly by the fence. One soldier, his back bare under the sun, strained to unroll a coil of wire, while another carefully welded the burst underground water pipe. Ellie stood there, clutching the hem of her shirt, speechless. She was not used to receiving help. For years she had only known giving, cantaloupe jam, a gentle smile, a quiet presence. Now, she was the one being assisted, and it made her heart both grateful and bewildered. Each day that passed brought new life to the ranch. They rebuilt the white wooden fence around the fields. One of the team, formerly a construction engineer, redesigned the livestock barn for greater efficiency. Another, once a mechanic, disassembled Ellie's father's old tractor, replacing every tiny bolt with tools he'd brought from home. No one asked Ellie how they should be repaid, nor did they expect anything in return. They worked for her, for the woman who had dared to show kindness to a man marked by war. Midday meals were shared around the weathered wooden table. Ellie cooked rice, fried eggs, and brewed iced tea in a large urn. Each time she ladled food onto plates, the soldiers laughed and swapped stories of their old unit and of those who never came home. In those brief moments, the little Arizona ranch became a temporary base where past and present met in mutual respect and peace. On the final day, when the last nail was driven into the new fence, Ellie stood silently, watching. She didn't know what to say. Her hands trembled. She understood that what they had done wasn't just about fixing barns or tractors. They had healed something deeper within her. Colonel Miles approached slowly, carrying a brown document box tied with cloth straps. He said nothing, handing it to her, then stepped back to give her space. Ellie opened it. Inside was a thick check, signed by the Veterans Support Foundation and by every member of Miles's team. She stared at it in disbelief. The amount was enough to pay off her bank debt, overhaul the entire irrigation system, and even purchase new seeds. Yet that was not all. Beneath the documents lay a gleaming metal coin, heavy and cool in her palm. One side bore an eagle's outstretched wings, with the inscription, "Valor is not in words, but in deeds." The reverse was engraved with military symbols and a code number, this team's unique insignia. Ellie clasped the coin in her hand and looked at the men before her. Her heart swelled, not for the money or the refurbished barn, but because for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be quietly recognized, to be seen without speaking a word. They climbed back into their vehicles with no ceremony, no waves goodbye. Only dust rose behind them, and the soldiers' silhouettes faded below the tree line. In Ellie's palm, the coin lay still, reminding her that small acts can carry power far beyond what we ever imagined. From that day on, Ellie's farm seemed reborn, not only by the new boards and the tractor that purred softly again, but by the gentle heartbeat of renewed trust. She was no longer the quiet woman alone on the parched plain. Outside her little roadside stall, where once stood only a few jars of cantaloupe jam and baskets of simple fruit, there now appeared a rustic wooden box worn by time. On it, Ellie had written in neat, graceful handwriting, "Take if you need, leave if you can." It was not a sales pitch, nor a rallying cry. It was simply a gentle message, like her silent smile each early morning, quiet, without fanfare. And then, something remarkable began to happen. In the first week, someone dropped in a bag of tomato seeds with a note reading, Good seeds from my mother's garden. Hope you like them. In the second week, there appeared a brand new shovel in the box, unsigned. Then came a small envelope containing a folded $20 bill with nothing written on it. Sometimes it was a single pumpkin or a handful of sunflower seeds. But Ellie understood. No names needed, no words of thanks required. They were exchanging trust, no strings attached, no conditions, through simple acts, just as she had once done. Each time she opened the box, Ellie felt as if she were listening to the heartbeat of the entire community. Quiet, yet powerful. Though no one spoke aloud, every gift softly whispered, "I see you. I know what you've done. And I, too, wish to do what's right." December arrived with Arizona's dry chill, wind whistling through the barn roof. But Ellie no longer felt the emptiness of past winters. She sat in her small kitchen, the yellow lamplight spilling across the wooden table where she was writing Christmas cards. 3 cards, each penned in careful cursive. The first went to her old friend in Portland, the one who'd sent the very plane ticket that started this journey. Ellie wrote, "I went, not just to leave Kingman, but to find myself again. Thank you for opening that door." The second was sent to the Veterans Support Foundation. In it, she briefly described the farm, the changes, and closed with one line. "What you didn't just change my life. It changed this whole town." And the final card, mailed to Colonel Miles Harper, read in her hand, slightly trembling from emotion. "The farm still stands, and so do I, thanks to the seeds of kindness you sowed." When spring returned, Ellie's fields were green not only with rows of cantaloupe seedlings, but with the burgeoning presence of friends, neighbors once shy, now stopping by more often. Some came in for a small melon, others brought their children to see the wooden box and to hear about the woman who gave up her seat. No two retellings were the same. Some added a dash of legend, others spoke plainly. But the constant was this. They remembered, they felt, and they passed it on. That story became part of the fabric of the town, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was profoundly human, deeply real, so close at hand. A small act, giving up a seat, had become the seed for an entire harvest of kindness. Ellie didn't need anyone to call her a hero. She still woke before dawn. She still turned the soil. She still wiped her brow on her sleeve. Yet now, in each small task, she knew she was no longer alone. And one late afternoon, as the sun set slowly on the horizon, its light gilding the endless cantaloupe fields, Ellie sat on the porch, cradling a warm cup of tea. The metal coin from that day, etched with the words, "Courage," not in words, but in deeds, still lay in her pocket, like a quiet reminder of a flight, of a single look, of an act of kindness that sought no reward, and of springs that begin not with rain, but with the human heart. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always wonderful to see friends joining us from around the world. Comment 1 if you enjoyed this story, so we can continue bringing you more stories you'll love.